In the grand scheme of the universe, humanity's entrance into galactic society had all the grace of someone wearing mismatched socks to a black tie event. The persistent rust bucket, a name that managed to be both accurate and understated, drifted into Starbase Delta 9 like a forgotten takeout container finally discovered under the couch. Its hull bore the proud patina of what generous observers might call character, and what everyone else called, how is that thing still spaceworthy? The QX Thalians, resplendent in their crystalline ships that looked like someone had weaponized a chandelier, didn't even try to hide their disdain. Their captain, High Commander Zixatal, actually pressed all four of his hands against his viewing screen in horror. That thing is approaching our docking space," he announced to his bridge crew, his voice carrying the same tone one might use to describe a particularly ambitious fungus attacking one's prized garden. "Sir," his first officer chimed in, "preliminary scans indicate it's held together by, is this correct, actual metal welding, not even molecular bonding?" The human vessel's pilot, a gruff individual who'd probably introduced himself at some point, but whom everyone just called Cap, guided his ship with the kind of precision that suggested either incredible skill or complete disregard for the laws of physics. The vessel's thrusters wheezed and coughed like an asthmatic dragon having an existential crisis. Around the starbase, ships from a dozen advanced civilizations performed their usual elegant dance of arrival and departure. The Andromedans in their bioorganic vessels that looked like spacefaring jellyfish, the Enixiviri whose ships bent light itself around their quantum matrices, and even the notoriously practical Zixians in their perfectly spherical craft that defied the very concept of aerodynamics, because in space, who needs them? And then there was the rust bucket, introducing itself to the pristine docking clamps with all the subtlety of a hammer introducing itself to a thumb. "Their shield technology must be absolutely primitive," remarked Professor Yix, a visiting Centaurian physicist whose species had mastered antimatter containment before humans had figured out indoor plumbing. "I detect only basic particle deflection, nothing like our triple-layered quantum barrier matrices." What the good professor failed to notice, however, was the slight shimmer in the space around the human vessel, a shimmer that would have been obvious to anyone who wasn't so busy being smugly superior. But then again, nobody ever looked too closely at the rust bucket. That was rather the point. Station Control, staffed by a rotating crew of various species who'd drawn the short straw in their career assignments, watched with a mixture of resignation and morbid curiosity as the human ship completed its docking procedure. The rust bucket's external cameras revealed a hull that appeared to be patched with what looked suspiciously like space-grade duct tape in at least 3 places. "Requesting permission to dock," Cap's voice crackled over the comm system, somehow managing to sound both bored and amused simultaneously. "Promise we won't get too much rust on your shiny station." The Kuthalian delegation, watching from their pristine observation deck, collectively shuddered as the docking clamps engaged. High Commander Zixatal turned to his aide, all 4 eyes narrowing in contempt. "Log this in today's report. Humans continue to be an embarrassment to spacefaring civilization. Their technology is barely above throwing rocks with ambitious trajectories." Little did the good commander know that beneath that apologetically rusty exterior, beneath the patches and the wheezing thrusters and the seemingly primitive shield technology, lay something that would soon make him eat those words. Hopefully not literally, though the humans did have a peculiar fondness for metaphors involving consumption. As Cap guided the final docking procedures, a small light flickered on his truly archaic-looking control panel. To anyone watching through the external cameras, and many were, if only to document what they assumed would be an inevitable disaster, it might have appeared to be just another malfunction in a ship full of them. But this particular light was actually a status indicator for something that would have made all those smug observers choke on their own superiority. The rust bucket settled into its berth with a series of creaks and groans that seemed calculated to set sophisticated alien teeth on edge. As the docking process completed, Cap allowed himself a small smile. Let them mock the rusty hull. Let them scan their primitive shields. let them write their condescending reports. After all, the best place to hide a warship was inside a joke. The next few cycles at Starbase Delta 9 unfolded with all the predictability of a quantum physics experiment run by a caffeinated squirrel. The QX Thalians, apparently not content with merely looking down their crystalline noses at the human vessel, decided to escalate their disdain into something more proactive. It started with the trade restrictions. Suddenly, every human cargo container needed triple verification, because obviously a species that couldn't even build a properly shiny spaceship couldn't be trusted with interstellar commerce. The Rust Bucket's crew took it with the kind of patience that made everyone nervous, though they probably shouldn't have started that betting pool on how many times High Commander Zixatal would twitch his upper left eye during inspections. "Look at this," Zixatal announced to a gathering of fellow ship captains, gesturing at a holographic display of the Rust Bucket's specs with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for describing particularly virulent diseases. "Their reactor is practically running on controlled explosions. It's barely more advanced than internal combustion." The gathered captains made appropriate noises of disgust, though the Andromedan representative did point out that at least the humans hadn't tried to power their ships with actual horses, which had apparently been a genuine concern when humanity first made contact. What nobody noticed, or more accurately, what everybody deliberately ignored, was how the Rust Bucket's supposedly primitive reactor never seemed to need refueling, or how its cargo holds, when scanned, showed slightly different dimensions depending on who was scanning and when. These were the kind of details that tended to get lost in the shuffle of superiority complexes and paperwork. The situation took a turn for the interesting when the QX Thalians began their military exercises in nearby sectors. Their fleet of crystalline warships performed intricate maneuvers that seemed designed specifically to demonstrate just how superior their technology was. The ships moved in perfect formation, their quantum-aligned weapon systems gleaming with barely contained energy. "Just routine exercises," High Commander Zixatal assured everyone, while simultaneously ensuring his ships just happened to block all major trade routes to human space. "We wouldn't want our less advanced friends to feel intimidated." Cap watched these displays from the Rust Bucket's observation deck, sipping something that claimed to be coffee, but had probably never met an actual coffee bean. "Mighty fine ships they got there," he remarked to his first officer. "Real pretty. Reminds me of my aunt's china cabinet." The first officer, whose name badge had been deliberately smudged to the point of illegibility, nodded sagely. "Shame about their blind spots, though." "Blind spots?" a passing Nexviri diplomat inquired, their tentacles twitching with curiosity. "Oh, you know," Cap drawled. "Them crystalline hulls. Real pretty, but they scatter sensor readings something fierce. Must be hard to see what's coming up behind you when your own ship's throwing off more reflections than a disco ball in a hall of mirrors." The diplomat later reported this conversation to Zixatal, who dismissed it as primitive attempts at psychological warfare, though he did order a comprehensive review of his fleet's sensor capabilities, just in case. Meanwhile, the Rust Bucket continued its seemingly haphazard trading runs, its hull acquiring new patches and rust spots with suspicious regularity. Each new repair made the QX Thalians more confident in their technological superiority, even as their own sensors began picking up strange anomalies at the edge of their exercise zones. "Probably just sensor ghosts," their technicians assured them. "Reflections from our own ships, obviously." The tension ratcheted up when a Thalian patrol decided to assist a human trading vessel by forcibly scanning its cargo. The ship's captain protested that the scan might interfere with their delicate navigation equipment. The QX Thalians laughed. What could possibly be delicate about human technology? The scan went ahead. 3 QX Thalian sensors immediately burned out. 2 navigation officers developed splitting headaches, and 1 junior technician swore he saw equations that made him question the nature of reality itself. "Technical malfunction," the patrol commander reported, trying to hide the fact that his ship's quantum computer had briefly started solving equations in base pi. Obviously, their primitive shielding caused some sort of feedback loop. Back on the Rust Bucket, Cap logged another entry in his suspiciously analog-looking logbook. Day 47. They still haven't figured it out. Running out of places to paint fake rust spots. Chief engineer suggests we start adding decorative duct tape to really sell it. The Cuxathalians continued their exercises, their fleet growing larger by the day. They didn't notice that every time they scanned the rust bucket, they got slightly different readings. They didn't notice that their own sensors seemed to work less efficiently around human ships. And they certainly didn't notice the subtle changes in subspace readings around their exercise zones. After all, what could a bunch of primitive humans possibly be hiding behind all that rust? The incident that finally popped the bubble of galactic smugness happened on what was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Because if humanity had learned anything from its own history, it was that the most interesting disasters always happened on Tuesdays. High Commander Zixatal had finally had enough of the human ship's continued existence, offending his aesthetic sensibilities. His fleet had grown to 30 ships, all crystalline masterpieces that looked like someone had militarized a jewelry store, and he decided it was time for a routine inspection of the rust bucket. "Your vessel," he announced over the comm channel with the kind of superiority that could probably be weaponized, "will submit to a complete scanning and boarding procedure, for safety reasons, of course." Cap's response crackled through with more static than strictly necessary. "Oh, shucks, Commander. Don't reckon that's a good idea right now. We're right in the middle of our weekly duct tape inventory." 3 Cuxathalian warships moved to surround the rust bucket, their quantum weapons charged and humming with enough energy to reduce most ships to their component atoms. The effect was somewhat spoiled by the rust bucket's external cameras catching one of the gunners trying to clean his targeting array after it got smudged by what appeared to be space dust. "This is not a request," Zixatal declared, all 4 hands dramatically positioned on his command console. "Your primitive vessel will be inspected, and we will finally prove that you are in violation of at least 17 different safety protocols. Possibly 18, if that patch on your port side is actually held on with what our sensors suggest is chewing gum." "Now see here," Cap drawled. "That's a specially formulated adaptive molecular bonding agent that just happens to look exactly like chewing gum. We've got standards." That's when the Cuxathalians made their first mistake. They fired a warning shot, a concentrated burst of quantum energy designed to disable the rust bucket's supposedly primitive shields. The beam hit something about 20 meters from the ship's hull and disappeared. Not reflected, not absorbed, just ceased to exist. As if it had run into something that told the laws of physics to take a coffee break, a moment of silence followed, broken only by the sound of several Cuxathalian sensor operators trying to recalibrate equipment that was suddenly insisting it was reading outputs in interpretive dance. "Huh," Cap's voice came through, still sounding bored. "Would you look at that? Must be a malfunction in your fancy weapons there. Want to try again? Maybe aim a little to the left this time?" The Cuxathalian ships fired again, this time with enough power to vaporize a small moon. The energy beams hit the same invisible barrier and turned into an impressive light show that spelled out "nice try" in 7 different languages. "Well now," Cap sighed, "that wasn't very neighborly." The rust bucket's hull began to shift. Patches of rust flaked away, revealing surfaces underneath that didn't so much reflect light as suggest that light might want to reconsider its entire approach to existence. The duct tape decorations melted into complex patterns that hurt to look at directly, and several Cuxathalian sensors simply gave up and displayed error reality overflow messages. "See," Cap explained, as his ship casually shrugged off another barrage that could have cracked a planet. "There's this funny thing about humans. We learned pretty early on that looking tough usually means you have to fight more often. But looking like you barely made it out of the scrapyard, that's when things get interesting." A panel slid open on the rust bucket's hull, revealing what appeared to be a weapons system that made the Cuxathalians' quantum arrays look like water pistols. It didn't glow, didn't hum with power, and didn't look particularly impressive. It just sat there, radiating the kind of potential energy that made quantum physicists wake up in cold sweats. "Now," Cap continued, his voice taking on an edge that could have cut through neutronium. About those safety protocols you were concerned about. Would you like to discuss the one about not pointing weapons at ships that are way out of your technological league? High Commander Zixtatal, watching his sensor readings descend into mathematical hysteria, made a sound that suggested his species had just invented several new curse words on the spot. News of the confrontation spread through galactic society faster than a quantum particle with an overdue library book. The Kirksithalians, trying desperately to save face, called for an emergency meeting of the local sector powers. They arrived in force, bringing their entire fleet, now numbering 50 ships that sparkled like a constellation having an identity crisis. The gathering at Starbase Delta 9 looked like someone had organized a spacefaring fashion show where everyone had simultaneously decided to be the main character. The Andromedans sent observers in their bioorganic ships, which were currently trying to evolve glands to produce anxiety medication. The NX Viri brought their quantum matrices, which kept trying to calculate the probability that they'd all collectively hallucinated the last few days. Even the Zixians showed up, their spherical ships arranged in what they insisted was a tactically optimal pattern, but looked suspiciously like a giant game of space marbles. 3 different species of bureaucrats had already filed complaints about the parking arrangements, and a minor diplomatic incident erupted when a Centaurian vessel accused a Nex Viri ship of taking up 2 spaces. The resulting argument had to be mediated by an artificial intelligence that eventually gave up and suggested they all take public transport next time. Meanwhile, the rust bucket sat quietly at its berth, now sporting what appeared to be a fresh coat of rust in interesting geometric patterns that made several mathematics professors request immediate sabbaticals. Someone had apparently added new duct tape to the hull in a pattern that, when viewed from exactly the right angle, seemed to spell out "having a great time, wish you were competent" in ancient Kirksithalian script. "This cannot stand," High Commander Zixtatal declared to the assembled representatives, all 4 arms gesturing so dramatically that his aide had to duck twice. "They have concealed advanced technology. They have deceived us. They have made us look ridiculous." "To be fair," an Andromedan diplomat pointed out, "you managed that last part entirely on your own." The emergency conference was interrupted by the arrival of more human ships. They dropped out of what the Kirksithalians had assumed was normal space, though the energy readings suggested the ships had actually dropped out of something that made normal space look like a crayon drawing. The way they appeared made several respected physicists excuse themselves to go lie down with a cold compress and a strong drink. Each human vessel looked more decrepit than the last, as if they'd held a competition for most likely to fall apart if someone sneezed too hard, and everyone had won first prize. One appeared to be held together by rubber bands and optimism. Another had solar panels that were clearly painted on. A third had windows patched with what looked like shower curtains, but somehow maintained perfect atmospheric integrity in ways that made physics professors weep. The newcomers arranged themselves in a pattern that didn't just break formation protocols. It took those protocols out back, gave them a stern talking to, and sent them home to rethink their life choices. Their positioning somehow managed to be simultaneously tactically perfect and visually reminiscent of a child's finger painting. "Right then," Cap's voice broadcasted across all frequencies, somehow managing to sound both completely relaxed and vaguely menacing. "We couldn't help but notice you folks called a meeting. Thought we'd invite a few friends. Hope you don't mind. They were in the neighborhood. Well, technically they were in several different neighborhoods across 3 dimensions, but who's counting?" High Commander Zixtatal's sensors tried to scan the human fleet. The results came back as interpretive poetry. His backup sensors tried again and started playing ancient human disco music. The emergency tertiary sensors took one look and filed for early retirement. The quantum computing core, faced with readings that questioned the fundamental nature of reality, began composing a philosophical treatise on the meaning of existence. "You have 1 standard hour," Zixtatal announced, trying to sound authoritative despite his command chair's sudden decision to start offering him therapeutic massage options. to explain yourselves and submit to proper inspection, or we will be forced to take action." The human ships responded by simultaneously dropping their rusty disguises. The transformation was like watching a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis, if the butterfly had been designed by someone who'd read too many books about impossible physics and decided that reality needed a good reshuffling. Beneath the rust and the duct tape and the painted-on solar panels lay ships that made the Kusthallian's crystalline fleet look like a child's first attempt at building with space Legos. Their hulls weren't just advanced. They seemed to actively argue with the nature of matter itself and win the argument. Every surface rippled with technology so sophisticated, it looped back around to looking deceptively simple. Several Kusthallian gunners reported that their targeting systems had taken one look at the transformed human ships and simply displayed, "Yeah, right," in blinking red letters. A junior engineer tried to analyze the human vessel's power systems and received a mathematical proof suggesting that the ships were simultaneously everywhere, nowhere, and possibly last Tuesday. "About that inspection," Cap drawled as his ship casually realigned itself in ways that shouldn't have been possible in three-dimensional space. "We've got a counter-proposal. How about you folks take a moment to reconsider every decision that led you to this point, and we'll pretend this whole thing was just a funny misunderstanding." The Kusthallian fleet's quantum computers chose this moment to unanimously declare that they needed a drink, which was impressive considering they weren't programmed with the concept of alcohol, or, for that matter, the need for emotional coping mechanisms. From the observation deck of Starbase Delta 9, the gathered diplomats watched as the human fleet performed maneuvers that made several physics textbooks spontaneously rewrite themselves. One Nexviri scientist had to be sedated after watching a human ship casually rotate through what appeared to be its own mathematical impossibility. A Zixian probability expert spent 10 minutes trying to calculate the odds of what they were seeing before their calculator displayed a message suggesting they find a new career in interpretive dance. The rust bucket, still maintaining its deliberately shabby appearance despite the revealed technological marvels around it, seemed to radiate an air of smug satisfaction. Its external cameras caught the moment perfectly as High Commander Zixatal's flagship, the pride of the Kusthallian fleet, quietly turned off all its weapon systems and tried to look as non-threatening as possible for a giant crystalline structure bristling with now obviously inadequate quantum weaponry. In the tense standoff that followed, the universe held its breath, or at least the part of it that wasn't too busy trying to reconcile what their sensors were telling them about the human fleet with what they thought they knew about reality. Several Kusthallian ships had resorted to the advanced tactical maneuver known as playing dead, hoping nobody would notice them slowly trying to drift away from the situation. High Commander Zixatal, faced with the kind of career-defining moment that usually ended up in history books under the chapter Catastrophic Miscalculations, did what any self-respecting military commander would do. He stalled. "Surely we can discuss this like reasonable beings," he broadcast, his voice hitting notes that suggested his vocal cords were trying to escape. "Perhaps over some refreshments? I hear humans are fond of something called coffee." "Funny you should mention reasonable beings," Cap replied, as his ship casually performed a maneuver that made Euclidean geometry file a formal protest. "We've been reasonable for quite a while now. Been reasonable about the trade restrictions, reasonable about the routine inspections, reasonable about you folks treating us like we just invented the wheel last Tuesday." The human fleet moved in perfect synchronization, executing a series of movements that shouldn't have been possible without violating at least 7 laws of physics. They weren't so much showing off as they were giving the laws of the universe a friendly wave goodbye as they passed by. "But see," Cap continued, "being reasonable doesn't mean being stupid. And pretending to be primitive doesn't mean we are primitive. It just means we learned something your shiny fleet seems to have forgotten. The best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know you have." A Nexviri analyst, watching the energy readings from the human ships, had to be restrained from trying to eat their own datapad out of sheer frustration. The readings weren't just impossible. They were impossible in ways that made other impossible things look mundane by comparison. The rust bucket, still maintaining its deliberately dilapidated appearance despite everything, performed what could only be described as a courtesy role. The movement caused several patches of carefully cultivated rust to rearrange themselves into complex fractal patterns that hypnotized 3 different sensor operators. "So here's what's going to happen," Cap announced, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made even stellar objects pay attention. "You're going to withdraw your fleet. You're going to drop these ridiculous trade restrictions, and you're going to stop assuming that something has to be shiny to be advanced." High Commander Zixatal, watching as his fleet's most sophisticated scanning equipment repeatedly returned results in the form of interpretive dance diagrams, made the wisest decision of his career. He surrendered. The withdrawal of the Cuxathalian fleet resembled nothing so much as a group of children who had just discovered their playground bully was actually a retired martial arts grandmaster. They maintained what dignity they could, which wasn't much considering 3 of their ships had developed what appeared to be spontaneous anxiety disorders. As the crystalline fleet departed, their hulls somehow managing to sparkle a little less confidently than before, the human ships began to resume their carefully crafted disguises. The advanced technology disappeared beneath fresh coats of rust, new patches of duct tape, and what appeared to be several strategically placed bumper stickers reading, "My other ship is a technological impossibility." The gathered diplomats, trying to process what they had just witnessed, found themselves facing a peculiar dilemma. How do you update your society's technological rankings when the species you thought was barely past steam power turns out to be so advanced they use quantum physics as a coffee table book? "You know what the funny thing is?" Cap mused over the general frequency as the situation wound down. "We didn't even have to show you the really advanced stuff. This was just what we use for grocery runs." The rust bucket settled back into its berth, creaking and groaning in ways that now seemed suspiciously theatrical. Its external cameras caught the moment perfectly as a junior Cuxathalian officer, passing by on their way to file what would probably be a very interesting report, stopped to stare at the ship's hull. There, written in what appeared to be fresh rust, but was actually a message composed in metadimensional quantum script that would take their civilization another 1,000 years to understand, was a simple phrase. "Appearances can be deceiving, but assumptions can be deadly." As normality slowly returned to Starbase Delta 9, or at least what passed for normality in a place where physics was treated more like a polite suggestion than a law, the human ships continued their trade routes. They still looked like they were held together by hope and hardware store supplies. They still creaked and groaned and complained. But now, when other species saw a rusty human vessel approaching, they didn't see primitive technology. They saw the galaxy's greatest practical joke, hiding in plain sight, and they wondered, with varying degrees of anxiety, just what else humanity might be hiding behind their carefully crafted facade of technological incompetence. After all, as High Commander Zixatal would later write in his memoirs, after a career change to philosophical poetry, in a universe of gleaming ships and transparent power, perhaps the most sophisticated approach is to appear unsophisticated. Also, I need a drink.